Hello, everyone, and welcome back after our exam. This week we'll be looking at life at home, examining families and relationships, and this will kind of tie into the information that we learned a couple weeks ago on gender and sexuality. So, our learning objectives for this week are to be able to define family and family dynamics. We also would like to understand the gender norms associated with family position. We would like to examine marriage and how it has changed over time, and be able to understand and define the darker side of family dynamics such as domestic violence, child abuse, and intimate partner violence. So, as always, when we start our lectures, we need to be able to understand the term family so that we can move forward and examine the family dynamics. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, family is defined as two or more individuals who are related by blood, marriage, or adoption and live in the same household. But sociologists define family in a different way. According to sociologists, a family is defined as a social group whose members are bound by legal, biological, or emotional ties, or a combination of all three. People in what sociologists define as a family may or may not share a household, but always are interdependent and have a sense of mutual responsibility for one another's care. This more open ended definition takes into account the diversity among today's families. For instance, if you have parents that are divorced, you're not living in the same household, but they are still both your parents and both a part of your family. There are also two other types of family, so we can break family down into an extended family and a nuclear family. An extended family is a large group of kin who are defined as relatives or relations who are usually related by common descent. So they are usually including at least 3 generations that live in either in a single household or in close proximity. Extended family most commonly includes a family with children and one or more set of grandparents, although that is not the only arrangement. When you think of kin, you might think of the family that you see at a reunion. You may know some of the people that you see, but there are probably also people you don't know, or at least people you don't know well. However, some common ancestry ties you together and makes you kin or kinfolk, and so they are a part of your extended family. A nuclear family is a couple with one or more children living in a single household. When we think of nuclear families, we tend to think of traditional families. However, it is important to note that nuclear families don't necessarily include a married couple. There are many different ways in which a nuclear family can be formed, but you can think of it as a two-parent household with children. So now that we've examined family and how it can be broken down into extended and nuclear families, we should also examine the different theoretical perspectives on family. Structural functionalism views the family as one of the basic institutions that keep society running smoothly by providing functions such as producing and socializing children, economic production, instrumental and emotional support. Conflict theory, on the other hand, believes that society revolves around conflict over scarce resources and that conflict within the family is also about the competition for resources, which include time, energy, and the leisure to pursue recreational activities. Symbolic interactionism, on the other hand, examines the types of social dynamics and interactions that creates and sustain families, emphasizing the ways in which our experiences of family bonds are socially created rather than naturally existing. And so, symbolic interactionists may look at children, siblings, and how they interact with one another, and how that's different among various families, whether it's families from different religious backgrounds, families that only have 2 children versus families that have 10 children, and so on. And lastly, the feminist and queer theorists examine how assumptions about gender and sexuality affect family relationships. They provide critiques of the notion of a traditional family as both heteronormative and inegalitarian. So here's a table in your book, and it kind of shows the different approaches to family and case studies through marriage. So structural functionalists say that marriage regulates sexuality and forms the basis for family with all of its other functions. Conflict theory views marriage as a civil right that was not extended to all same sex couples in the US until 2016. Non traditional families are still marginalized in many ways, while the nuclear family remains the standard. And so there's a conflict between the traditional family and the same sex couples because there's an unequal distribution of power and discrimination. Symbolic interactionism says that marriage is not made solely by completing a legal contract, but it's also constructed through the accumulation of everyday interactions between partners over the years. Rules and expectations may vary from one marriage to another. So, again, they're looking at how um, marriage in one family may require that both the mom and dad work, and then in another family, maybe it's two dads and one dad stays at home and the other one works. And how are these rules different among different families? These theories also examine how individuals select their mate or their partner. And so there are a few terms that I'll talk about in this slide and the next slide. Homogamy means like marries like, and so it's demonstrated in the fact that we tend to choose partners that are similar to us in class, race, ethnicity, age, religion, education, and even levels of attractiveness. Um, and then propinquity is the tendency to marry or have relationships with people who are in close geographic proximity. The process of selecting mates is largely determined by society. So, homogamy and propinquity tell us a lot about how this process works. Propinquity is logical. We're likely to find possible mates or partners among the people in our neighborhood, at work, or at school. The internet makes dating and romance possible across much greater geographical areas now because we can meet and converse with people in all parts of the world. So our pool of potential partners moves beyond local boundaries now. But even this technology may intensify homogamy by bringing people together with very specific interests and identities. Another couple vocabulary words would be endogamy and exogamy. Endogamy refers to marriage to someone within one social group, and exogamy refers to marriage to someone from a different social group. Endogamy tends to be more common for a variety of reasons. From the time of slavery through the 1960s, many states had laws that prohibited interracial marriage, cohabitation, or sexual interaction. These laws were effectively ended by the Supreme Court case Loving versus Virginia in 1967, which was a landmark civil rights case in which the United States Supreme Court, by a 9-0 vote, declared Virginia's laws on interracial marriage were unconstitutional, thereby ending all race based legal restrictions on marriage in the U.S. Nonetheless, we still tend to have de facto segregation in our society as a result of housing patterns, economic patterns, and more. So we tend to meet people of similar backgrounds. There are also social pressures to marry people of similar backgrounds. But it is true that exogamy is becoming more commonly acceptable, but it's still less common than endogamy. We also have various relationship trends that have changed throughout time. There have been increases in the numbers of single people, people who are cohabitating, single parents, and people who are living in intentional communities. Married couples were the dominant household model through the 1950s, but their numbers have decreased from nearly 80% in 1960 to 48% in 2016. Currently, 28% of all households are made up of people who live alone, and about 7% of all households, or 8% of adults, are occupied by couples who are cohabitating or living together as a romantically involved unmarried couple, and this also includes both same sex and opposite sex couples. And currently, 40% of all first births are to unmarried partners, the majority of which are to cohabitating couples. It's also become a norm to break up. Because there's less marriage, it's easier to just break up with the people that you're cohabitating with. In 2018, about 55% of persons aged 18 and up in the US were married, while about 10% were divorced. Remarriage is also common. 64% of previously married men remarry compared to 52% of previously married women. Women and men are also treated differently after they've broken up. Mothers are still disproportionately receiving custody, but there is now a trend toward joint custody as well. Women are also more likely to suffer downward economic mobility after divorce, especially if they retain custody of their children. And this kind of relates to the feminization of poverty that we discussed in our previous lecture on gender. Being the sole provider has a negative financial implication on women, which tends to lower their socioeconomic status and earning potential. So, if we think about it, a single mother who has custody of their children is more likely to face discrimination in the workplace and have a lower socioeconomic status than a woman who has never been married or has never had a kid or custody of their kid. Additionally, men and women have performed different roles to ensure the survival of their families, but these roles were not considered unequal until after the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, work started taking place outside the home for a paid wage. As a result, this kind of work became valuable, which is also when housework became unvalued because it was not associated with an earned wage. Women nowadays have two jobs. They have paid labor outside the home and unpaid labor inside the home. So now that we've discussed both the paid labor and the unpaid labor, there are types of unpaid work that are necessary to keep a family operating. And there are two tasks associated with the unpaid work, which are instrumental tasks and expressive tasks. Instrumental tasks include the practical physical tasks necessary to maintain family life, such as washing dishes and cutting the grass. Expressive tasks refer to the emotional work necessary to support family members, such as remembering a relative's birthday or playing with the children. Ideally, men or women could perform either or both types of work as they see fit and feel comfortable. But we tend to see gender roles and expectations placing men into one category and women into the other. So it is no surprise if you thought that men belong into the instrumental task group while women belong into the expressive task group. This is because we have been raised and socialized to believe that women are more emotional and tied to their emotions, and they can have emotional work, but they shouldn't take on physical tasks such as cutting the grass. And as mentioned in the previous lecture on gender, there is the second shift, and this refers to women who do both unpaid labor inside the home as well as paid labor outside of the home. With that in mind, we should also talk about family and the life course. So, children's experiences are shaped by family size, birth order, presence or absence of parents, socioeconomic status, and other sociological variables. In turn, the presence of children affects the lives of the parents. So, children's experiences could be shaped by the fact that both parents work. The mom does both the second shift, where she goes to work and she comes home and does the work, while the dad does outside work and he doesn't really do a lot of the housework at home. And because of this, because both parents are working, children may experience an absence of parents, and that may shape their life course and their family and their experiences. Another example would be that marital satisfaction tends to decline where there are small children in the house, and a couple's gender division of labor tends to become more traditional when children are born. When a family has a child, whether the first or the 10th, a new dynamic is introduced into the system, which causes instability. The instability is only temporary, however, there is always friction when an existing arrangement is changed. So every time a new child is brought in, there's more likely to be arguments, there's more likely to be women taking on more of the care roles where they feed the baby, clothe the baby, and just a lot of dissatisfaction. Children's experiences are also based on, in many ways, their standing in the family, whether they're a firstborn, middleborn, lastborn, or an only child. And so I'm sure you've seen all over social media and even heard that each child, depending on whether they're a middle child or not, or a firstborn or not, have different personalities. Because firstborns are typically associated with being perfectionistic and achievers and leaders, and so they have a certain personality that's different from the middle child, who is more independent but often feels left out and tries to be the peacemaker. The lastborns are usually the social, outgoing children, but they also constantly seek attention because they are the last child and they are often babied, which is also why they are self centered sometimes. And then there's the only child who are confident, they're responsible, they're perfectionists, they're the center of attention, they're more mature for their age, but they're also sensitive and they can be a leader. So they kind of take on all of the good characteristics of each of the first, middle, and last born children. So the question is this really true? Is this a trend that we see? And so I've assigned an article on does birth order affect our personality? And I think it'll be an interesting read for you all, and hopefully you can apply it to your own life and see if it's accurate or not. So we've talked mostly about family and the impact of children on the family, as well as the different types of paid and unpaid labor. With this, we also need to think about the other end of the spectrum, which is instead of the younger children, it would be the elderly individuals. And we've noticed that the American population is aging because of the baby boom generation. We see that life expectancy in the United States is 79, with women living an average of 5 years longer than men. But with that comes some trouble because retired citizens might have limited financial resources that put them at risk of poverty. As of 2016, 9.3% of the elderly live below the poverty line. And Social Security benefits are the major source of income for most of the elderly in the United States. So we are having an increasing generation of elderly individuals, but they are also more likely to live in poverty because they are living off of Social Security benefits. We've also noticed that the care of the elderly is no longer a primary function of the family. That is, that most elderly don't live with their family members or with their daughters and sons. There are, however, some senior citizens that live with family members, which creates what is called a sandwich generation. Though 45% of women aged 75 and older live alone. Of those aged 85 and older, 9% live in an institutional setting, such as a nursing home. And the elderly also have to cope with the transitions of retirement, widowhood, declining health, and death, and these are central tasks for the seniors. So we've talked about the children of the family, the women, the men, the elderly. Now it's time to talk about the darker side of family dynamics, specifically domestic abuse, child abuse, and intimate partner violence. Domestic abuse is by far the most common form of family violence. It includes behaviors abusers use to gain and maintain power over their victims. Forms of abuse can include physical, verbal, financial, sexual, and psychological. So, physical meaning that one can harm the other physically by hitting them or grabbing them um, and physically harming them. Verbal abuse would be things like a husband telling his wife that she's stupid, that she's never going to be able to make it out on her own, which is why she has to depend on him. And then there's financial abuse, which is when one of the individuals in the family is taken advantage of um, through monetary values. So maybe the woman makes money, but all of that money goes toward her husband, and so she's financially abused because she doesn't have a right or a claim to her money. And I know that I'm using examples of women being the ones that are abused, but there are situations in which men are also going through domestic abuse as well. So I don't want to um, take away from that. There's also sexual abuse, which we know about, and psychological abuse, which is basically where someone is torn down mentally, always being put down in a way, whether that's through verbal or physical or financial or sexual forms of abuse. So, psychological abuse may be a result of all the other forms. We also have intimate partner violence, which involves violence between individuals who are or were in a close relationship, such as marriage or dating. More than 37% of women are the victims of sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking over the course of their lifetime. Almost 50% of women have experienced psychological aggression over the course of their lifetime. So, there also is a cycle of violence. There are 4 stages, and it seems to occur in almost every abusive relationship. In the first stage, the abusive partner is charming, attentive, and thoughtful. Disagreements are glossed over, and the relationship looks stable and healthy. However, tension is building to the second stage, which is often described as walking on eggshells. Here, both parties sense that something will happen no matter what the victim may do to try to avoid it. During the third stage, acute battering and violence occurs, lasting for seconds, hours, or even days. The abuser will invariably blame the victim for the incident. It is always the victim's fault in the abuser's eye. The fourth stage, which is often referred to as loving contrition, is the honeymoon phase and is one of the reasons why victims remain in violent relationships. After the violence, the abuser will apologize profusely and promise that it will never ever happen again. Rates of domestic abuse are about equal across racial and ethnic groups, sexual orientations, and religious groups. People are more likely to be killed or attacked by family members than by anyone else. We tend to think of attacks or murders being committed by total strangers in dark alleys, but the reality is that this kind of violence is far more common among people who know one another. It is also important to recognize that this kind of violence can occur on college campuses. Most colleges have resources or counselors available to help students in troubled situations. Our college does have help if you need it, and I have included this in the syllabus for counseling services and who you can turn to if you've experienced any form of sexual assault and things like that. So, children and elderly can also suffer at the hands of abusive family members. Child and elder abuse are often underreported, due in part to the relative powerlessness of the victims in the private settings of the abuse. Neglect is the most common form of abuse for children, and it is a form of abuse in which the caregiver fails to provide adequate nutrition, sufficient clothing or shelter, or hygienic and safe living conditions. And as I mentioned, it affects children and the elderly and accounts for 75% of child abuse. Elder abuse can also include things like violence and abuse, as well as financial exploitation, theft, neglect, and abandonment. Many states have special laws that give extra protection to elderly or minor individuals. For instance, the punishment for child abuse or elder abuse may be harsher than for the abuse of an individual who is neither a child nor the elderly. Okay, so at this point we've pretty much concluded the lecture. We have covered a lot of ground we first began by defining family and examining how family can be split up into extended family and nuclear family. We've talked about birth order and how that can influence children. We have talked about the work of family, the second shift, and gender roles. We have also talked about marriage rates and divorce rates, and then we finished by talking about the darker side of families by examining intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, child abuse, and elder abuse. I know it wasn't so great to end on such a depressing and dark topic, but at this point, what's left to do? We should finish reading chapter 12 if you haven't already. There's an online article on Blackboard for you. It says, "Does birth order affect personality?" I also have assigned a video for you to watch on Blackboard. You have an inquisitive quiz due by 11:59 p.m. on November 15th. You should participate in discussion 6 and at least respond to one classmate, which is also due November 15th at 11:59 p.m. And you should finish your critical thinking exercise. I have asked you to turn in the 2-page double-spaced reflection. You can turn it in on the CTE section of Blackboard. It will be due 11:59 p.m. on November 15th as well. Looking ahead, next week we will be examining politics, education, and religion, and I have assigned chapter 10 for that, so if you would like, you can begin to read or prepare for that chapter. All right, have a good week, everyone.